Hi Booktube and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads for 8 books. Twilight by Chilean writer Nona Fernandez, translated by Natasha Wimmer. Ascension, the new novel by Steve Tomasula. The Women of Tijucopap, excuse the pronunciation. This is by Brazilian author Marilene Felinto, translated by Irene Matthews. Purple West by Jonathan Trosclair. The Schoolhouse by Sophie Ward, her second new novel that came out a couple of weeks ago. George Perec, Things, a story of the 60s, and a second story, A Man Asleep. These were both translated by the same translator, were they? Yes, David Bellos, who was a huge Perec. He worked with Perec a lot. And finally, poetry, Jackie Kay's The Adoption Papers. Not finally, sorry, there's one that's already been put in the shed, which should tell you what I think of it. Sara Gran's City of Ghosts. So I'm going to start with the Nona Fernandez. This is the second of her novels that I've read. I think there's only 2 translated into English. And I think this one came before her other one, which is called Space Invaders. And like Space Invaders, it's about a child in Chile who was born during the Pinochet dictatorship, where lots of people were disappeared, tortured and murdered. And that is the theme of this book. That as a girl, a dissident magazine comes into her possession, and on the front is a picture of this guy with the headline, "I am a torturer." And this guy looks very ordinary. She thinks he might even look like a science teacher at school, and thus begins a lifelong obsession with everything to do with his confessions about what he got up to as a torturer, which she didn't directly experience, but she remembered as a child going on vigils and wakes and protest marches. So this guy, who is a member of Pinochet's sort of intelligence service, comes into the office of the distant newspaper and says he wants to, lay out the truth of what he's been up to, because he can't live with the sort of shame and guilt and everything about it. And then he's whisked away to continental Europe to, so that he's not nobbled by his own former colleagues. Now, the way this book is done is that, and the reason it's called the Twilight Zone, is because it's very much from the perspective of a child who first embraces this mania, obsession, and it's very mixed in with what's going on in her life ordinarily, like watching programs of the Twilight Zone and what music she was listening to and what was going on at school. And because of the subject matter, you can't say they're shaggy dog stories, but the way she weaves in these quite banal elements of a child's life into a rather sort of magical thinking on her part, because she has to fill in the spaces in between. The people that this guy tortured are no longer here, so she can't get their testimony. She never meets this guy because he's living in mainland Europe somewhere. So she's using her imagination to fill in the gaps in between what he says. So you get this sort of rather, as I say, a banal sort of what's going on in a child's life, with this adult creative imagination as a writer, as an author, to sort of spin these tales. So there's 4 sections, and each one basically deals with a significant opposition members to Pinochet's regime and how they were abducted, tortured and died. And I think it all comes together the best in the 4th and last section, where she's relaying how she was in a school play where they all had to dress up as pirates and they used burnt cork to do their moustaches. She interweaves that with the disappearance of one of her schoolgirls, the one who was always called out in the register after her name on alphabetical order, and one day she's not there. She doesn't disappear because of her family being opposition, far from it. Her father is actually a member of the this intelligence service that disappears people, and the disappearance of 3 communist members. And the way she weaves it together is just fantastic. The way all these elements come and each reinforces the other. And I think it's really well done. The only thing I will say is that she wrote about the disappearance of that school friend in Space Invaders, and Space Invaders is also a metaphor used here, again, rather brilliantly, I feel. I don't remember it being used in quite so overtly in the book called Space Invaders, but you know, that could be down to my memory. And I'm always sort of reluctant to, you know, writers are allowed their obsessions, their manias. They're allowed to keep writing about the same theme over and over again. But for me, they have to find different ways of doing it. And I did feel that potentially, because she'd covered this ground in her other novel, that I was going to knock a star off for that. And in fact, I didn't, because it's done in such a refreshing way. The metaphor of the Space Invaders was so good that, you know, I still think this is a very strong piece of work. 4 stars. And on to Ascension. Now, this is the second Steve Tomasula book I've read. The other one was called, what was it called? Oh yes, The Book of Portraiture. And in a way, the style and the structure is very similar. That there are historical elements which get their own section, and then we end up in a modern research laboratory, as we do here. But I think this is far superior to The Book of Portraiture. The theme of this book is environmental collapse, really. So section 1 is about 80 pages, or maybe even less than that, actually 60 pages, and we have an explorer come scientist at the time of the American Civil War breaking out, which he takes as a rather sort of doomsday event. So there's an element of him sort of fleeing from that, and he's in the jungles of Paraguay because he's looking for a fossil which he believes will prove that there's a direct link between birds, dinosaur, and to the rest of evolution, including man. And he hooks up with this native guide, and they go into the deep jungle to see if they can find fossil record. The problem, of course, of fossil records of birds is that birds are in the air, so the chances of them sort of leaving a fossil record in the stone behind is far lower than for other creatures. This is also the time of Darwin's Origin of Species, and he has sort of in a way his faith, not his religious faith, but his faith and belief are being eroded because of all these new revelations that Darwin has provided. Because now the invention of the sort of primitive camera, no longer are naturist books where they have text, but then they have hand drawings by the nature observers of all the animals they're describing. It's slowly being replaced by photographic plates. So there's definitely a movement in sort of technology and scientific principle and just sort of technology, you know, the technology of the American Civil War that he's fled. So that was really good. Then part 2 is again sort of maybe sort of more contemporary. Again, we're back in Paraguay. We're with another explorer come biologist who is a specialist in lice. She's a biologist specialist in lice, or no, not a botanist. Anyway, a zoologist specialist in lice, and she has a theory on the. She's on this expedition which is being filmed, and she sees this louse that looks like nothing that she's known before. But not because it's a new species, but rather it's a prehistoric species of louse. That because it hadn't specialised in hadn't had time to specialise in evolution, could bite through both skin and also feathers, bird feathers, because lice are wonderfully adapted to be able to bite through whatever surface of the host that they land on, be it animals, humans, or birds, and they have different mouth parts to be able to bite through what presents them. And she thinks that this is evident, you know, that this is evident if she can prove that this primitive louse can bite through both feathers and skin, that it would have lived on birds which she claims were originally dinosaurs, or dinosaurs were originally birds, because it had to bite through both skin and feathers, because dinosaurs in her belief weren't entirely covered in feathers, but part. So she's on the track of this louse, and again she's bemoaning how now everything is digital camera rather than, again, the sort of proper scientific rigour of before, of you know, sort of a bit like the scientist in the first part he was complaining about camera stills, and now she's almost sort of wanting that, and again wanting the sort of the drawings of creatures, the drawings of life, and it's again sort of taking on further from Darwin. The challenge she faces is that all science has been done through comparing genes, whereas she's looking at the physical parts of the lice's mouth parts. So she's doing it by sort of eye, whereas DNA would just sort of render that sort of nugatory. So that's part 2, and then we come to the long part 3, which is the bulk of the book, which is set in a near dystopian future where the world is basically collapsing. A lot of the earth or a lot of the countries of the earth have disappeared beneath the waves, or have become too hot, and people can't live there. So there's a massive migration movement called something like the something billions, and that creates obviously social pressures. And we're in this lab, which again are working with lice, because they have a theory that because birds are wild and they fly in the air out of man's grasp, you can't kill them all. But what you can do is try and inoculate them from passing on pandemic viruses. This is recently after COVID. Because if the lice can deliver their normal sort of blood sucking of birds, but if they can find the right vaccination to vaccinate the birds so the birds can't spread the avian borne diseases, then bingo, you're in. But so we get this cast of characters in the lab, and we are treated to each of their individual stories, which are very, very, very interesting in their own right. One of them has lost an 8-year-old son to a tsunami, and she's constantly exploring the online sort of virtual world to see if clues turn up, if somehow he's still alive. So each character has their own story, and they work within their own regard. There's also lots of QR codes printed in the book which link to videos of things like sort of crime patterns, of death rates, of proof of voter interference in elections, and that these QR codes do work. These are existing YouTube sites. I got my son to test it because I don't have a smartphone. So that's a really interesting innovative thing. But it's really the environmental stuff that sort of seeps through that I think is it's his ability to draw a metaphor together by mixing a man-made element with a nature from element. And he does this time and again in a superlative way. So, if the parasites grow too weak, the hosts kill them. If the parasites grow too strong, they kill the host, and then they both die. Easy to forget, given that the odds have been so heavily weighted in favour of the host, planet Earth, for all of our human history. For millennium, people applied themselves to learning how to build shelters against Earth's weather, how to generate heat and cold to defeat its seasons, how to wage war on beetles, claw their way above the winds of nature. But then the Earth's parasites, people, began to become too successful, too strong, too numerous. They built too many houses, owned too many teak countertops, needed too many trains and planes and automobiles, and plastic cafeteria trays, and TV shows, and billion-watt casinos, not caring how much they heated the air outside in order to make an artificial Arctic indoors. Their efforts to combat their host, their mother, grew too potent as they found ever more efficient ways to convert her lungs into lumber, her veins into rails and smoke, their numbers and efforts fouling her breath, her rivers, and now their host was dying. And when it died, so would they. At least enough to put the earth back into what? Not the balance those Paraguayan Indians used to believe in. For surely the earth was just the earth. What matter to the earth if there were 2 or no ice caps? The earth would go on completely covered in water as it once was, or as the scorching desert it seemed determined to become. So there he's, as I say, he sort of mixed the idea of the host, of the sort of parasites that, they're studying in lice, with planet Earth and the people, us humans, as parasites. And as I say, he does this time and again. And to me, this book is such a successful environmentalist book. I've always been on the lookout for one. A lot of them can't cope with the scale of it, and I think this book does. And then another just little example. So Mohammed, who's one of the workers at the lab, is on a migrant's visa, and obviously called Mohammed. He's a Muslim, and the FBI are interrogating him. The FBI are interested in a plot supposedly by ISIS to kill off the bee population. No matter what he told them about his job, they kept bringing the conversation back around to honeybees. From their questions, he could tell they were investigating something to do with the collapse of the honeybee colonies that were occurring all over the country. Yes, he knew about it, everyone did. After the bee colony collapses of the OOs, all kinds of groups had taken to weaponising nature. Killer bees were an invasive species in Washington. ISIS had been linked to sterile bees in France. Anyone with a charge card and a kitchen could do it. Anyone with a newsfeed knew about it. Were they playing dumb? Should he? If he did, would he look like he was hiding something? He decided to say exactly what he knew, not more, not less. When they asked him what he thought was causing all of these bee colonies to fail, he gave them the pantheon of explanations that had appeared in the journals. The dances bees did to alert others in hive of sources of nectar were being confused by cell phone transmissions, or climate change, or pesticides, emanations from power lines. So many causes had been proposed that it was the same as not having any explanation at all. But what would you do if you wanted to bring down a beehive, the female agent asked. Bring down, as if beehives were the twin towers. A vision of what they saw when they looked at him snapped into focus. So again, it's what I was saying about how he sort of weaves together sort of nature and man's impact on nature, where, for example, he lists an awful lot of occasions where mankind has tried to deal with one problem in nature, be it a parasite or a disease or whatever, and by unintended consequences unleashes something that's far, far worse. Usually the introduction of an animal species to another country or another continent to deal with a local problem in the threatens agriculture or whatever. The one slight reservation I have about this book is I was slightly perplexed about when part 3 is set, because there's an awful lot of references to things we would recognise, such as Pizzagate and sort of Trumpers turning up with automatic rifles to that pizza restaurant because they believed in the basement was a child trafficking ring, all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of that very recent news items that we would recognise. And yet the physical state of the world, you've lost a third of the globe too. So I don't know if his point there is just how immediate this is, how just around the corner all of this sort of catastrophe is. But I couldn't quite balance the exactly when part 3 was set. But it didn't matter. I really thought this was fantastic. 5 stars. And on to the women of Tijucopap. I saw Roz at Skelly Dangling about the books talk about this when she read it for Shorty September, and yeah, she was right to recommend this. The 2 angriest novels I've ever read have both been written by Brazilians, of which this is one. Make of that what you will. The other is Cup of Rage by Raduan Nasser. So this is a book about a woman in Sao Paulo who, as a child, had a very abusive upbringing at the hands of her father, who was a strict disciplinarian, would beat her for virtually everything. But I want to read you this. They told me I live as if I was at war, on the warpath, and I definitely do. And I'd add that I live in combat, under bomb attack, in conflict, and I won't calm down till I kill someone. When I was a little girl, I always clung to the idea that I would kill my father. I didn't kill him. I wouldn't kill him now, but the desire to kill someone still remained. And in a way, what she does is she transfers that sort of bloodlust she goes on a journey back to the northeast of Brazil, to where her mother is from originally, because she feels her mother has lost herself, that she was from this sort of race of Amazonian warriors, women warriors. And yet when she moves to the big city and takes up with her father, that her mother lost all of her warrior nature, warrior spirit. And that's why this girl, now woman, has found herself in the state that she is, because her mother didn't sort of protect her. So her anger is transferred from her father, who was just being you know, male and father-like in her eyes, to her mother. And in order not to murder her mother, she wants to go and discover the parts of her mother that the mother has lost, see how and why that happened, and then maybe she would find some sort of understanding through that. I'm going back to Tijucopap to see if I know. It was there that my mother was born. I had to leave. I'm going there to see if I know why I'm able to be cruel and not love as well as hate. I'm going to Tijucopap to see if I know why I'm poor. Afterwards, I'll paint the revolution. So just this anger that comes through is just, it sounds odd, but it was a joy to read. I mean, I really appreciated the passion. Yes, it reminds me of Clarice Lispector. The difference, I'd say, is Lispector's work is undercut with a spirituality, which is based in Christianity, I feel. Here, this is also based in a spirituality, and even though the character says that she's a Christian, I actually think her spiritual life of the ancestors that she's been cut off from is much more sort of primitive, as I say, sort of Amazonian warriors. So I would distinguish her from Lispector in that respect. But terrific, 5 stars. And on to Purple West by Jonathan Trosclair. I saw Fraser over at Springboard Thought talk about this. It's a very small edition, but yeah, you know, because you're going to get that amount of words on the page, it's lots of pages. It's about 375 pages. This is published by Corona Samizdat, which is a very interesting independent imprint. Anyway, so there's an Albanian migrant who's working in the near future. This is set in Decatur, which is that Illinois or Missouri. Anyway, Decatur has become a significant town in this slightly dystopian world, which is ruled by data. And one of the clients that she is sequestered to, they basically need her to alter her data projections because they have to sort of get their investors off their backs because they're saying you're running late, you're not going to make the money. So she comes up with these figures that will suggest that they'll get such a big margin of 20% that the investors need to hold their nerve. And it's all a bit of a game, really. And 2 migrant workers who work for this company die on the job, as we know happens in the building of Qatar's World Cup stadium, so very, very live issue there. And indeed, there are lots of live issues that this is concerned with, including things like, again, sort of voter fraud from outside powers, you know, the use of data and all that sort of thing. So it's very current in that sense. So she sort of is beginning to become embroiled in the fallout from this company losing 2 of its employees, although the city of Decatur has so many migrants that they're up in arms with their sort of political supporters, and they're basically rioting in the streets. And I will say the strongest part of this book for me was a very long car journey through the riot, and I thought that was terrifically handled. But I did struggle with this a bit because she never knows really who she's working for. Everything seems to be done under 2 flags, that people present themselves as this, but actually she's working for some sort of far more shadowy corporation behind that. And she's always off balance. She doesn't know who she's working for. And as we're looking through her eyes, neither do we, the reader. And it's never really explained quite what the point of all of this is, who's manipulating who and for why. You know, on the one hand you've got big corporations and capitalism and money, and on the other hand is people who are trying to open source everything and sort of mass using sort of blockchain technology to mean that everything goes back to the people and that the authorities can't track it down, can't control it and stuff, which is interesting. But I just felt that there was no real focus because as I say, the main character didn't really know what was going on, therefore neither did we, and it did fall a bit short accordingly for me. 3 stars. And on to The Schoolhouse by Sophie Ward. She wrote the debut novels called Love and Other Thought Experiments, which I thought was fantastic, gave 5 stars. This is a very different book. That was a book that was experimental in style, had lots of philosophical ideas. This is a much more straight thriller genre book. That's a decision she's consciously made, and I respect that. But I have to say I did enjoy the other, you know, it's much more in my wheelhouse to have sort of experimental form and big ideas. This is a story of sort of 2 child abductions over 2 generations and how they're linked and stuff. What I found interesting was that Sophie Ward acknowledges and dedicates the book to sort of the Montessori school, you know, the system that she was a student of, and she dedicates it to students who came through it. So you think it's all going to be about sort of alternative education systems, and after all it's called the schoolhouse and it is set there. But surprisingly, I didn't really feel that was a theme of the book. It could have been any school really. Yes, they had a slightly different timetable for the students and stuff, but the actual story of student interaction and student teacher interaction could have been in any school. And I found that slightly surprising that I didn't feel that she actually focused in on what she wanted to focus in, given what she acknowledged. So I did find it all a bit sort of underwhelming, I have to say. 3 stars. And onto The Adoption Papers by Jackie Kay, which I saw Matthew Shirapa describe as the book that got him into poetry. And I can see exactly why he said that. So it's divided into 2 sections. The first is The Adoption Papers, how Jackie Kay, who was born from Afro-Caribbean parents, was adopted by white Scots. And the first part is divided into 3 character voices who are given their own different typography, so you can distinguish one from the other. One is the little girl, i.e. her. One is her adopting mother, and one is her mother who gave her up for adoption. And it's all, you know, it's all pretty what you'd expect. I mean, the mother who gave her up for adoption is perhaps the least well covered, because she's absent from her life until she becomes an adult, when they do find each other again. But, you know, it kind of does what it says on the tin. It was the second part, which had nothing to do with the adoption, which I found much more interesting, much more varied, about sexuality, identity. She uses the metaphor of the Great Storm in 1988, maybe, in the UK, which you know, levelled ancient forests. Seven Oaks was named after the fact it had 7 oaks, and 6 of them blew down in the storm. And she uses that to underpin each of these very diverse poems about diverse subjects, as I say, about sexuality and gender and race. And I thought they were terrific. So I can't remember exactly, I probably gave this 3.5 or 4 stars. On to Sarah Gran's City of Ghosts, which again I saw Fraser over at Springboard Thought talk about. The first in the Kathy DeWitt detective series, set in post-Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans. And I picked it up because the way I've seen it described is that, you know, it's a refreshing take on the private investigator genre. I didn't see that. The character was an odd mix. The Kathy DeWitt character was an odd mix of sort of being influenced by Eastern spirituality and her whole approach to life and observation, being through that, and yet she is a heavy drinker and drug taker. And I don't see how those two reconcile at all. It makes no sense to me. I don't believe you can have the insights of Eastern mysticism if you're just, you know, basically abusing detrimental substances. It was very, very good though on post Katrina New Orleans, the descriptions of the damage and stuff. And interestingly, the case that she's involved in, which was again about somebody missing. It was assumed originally that he just had drowned under Katrina, during Katrina, but then there were sightings of him helping to save people in a boat that he'd rigged up, and it was all to do with him and sort of basically homeless black youngsters who basically turn to crime and become gangbangers. I found that completely uninvolving, because at times it was really about the relationships she forged with these black gangbangers, with homeless people, with other people who are completely burnt out by either their life experiences or the experience of Katrina. These went on for a very, very long time in sort of descriptive terms, but they were good. But what they also did is, unfortunately, I think, is reduce the interest and fail to hold my interest in the case that was under study. So when I put that together with the fact I didn't buy her character that was drinking and drugging with these black youths and stuff, it didn't really work for me and doesn't make me want to go and read others in the series. It was, you know, I had one or two very good lines, but again, they related to New Orleans rather than other things. So there was a line when she's sort of looking at these gangbangers, like the arsenal of weapons that they've accumulated, and she sort of says, well, it was enough to sort of go and invade Fallujah in Iraq. Or there was another line how after Katrina, folk from New Orleans, you know, they may have gone back, but it was just too untenable, so they moved to places like Detroit, which was definitely an upgrade. And when you think how bad Detroit is, so, you know, there were one or two good lines, but not enough to sustain me, so 3 stars. And finally, on to Georges Perec, Things, A Story of the 60s, which is his debut novel, but then also A Man Asleep, which I think was, again, a very early work of his, combined into one edition here. I actually read this a while ago, and I just forgot to include it in my previous video, which is silly, because I love Perec, he's never let me down. So Things, A Story of the 60s. So a couple, a man and a woman, emerged from university with their degrees, and are about to enter sort of grown-up life, as it were. But they don't really want to give up the social side of university, so they don't get proper jobs. They get sort of part-time or piece jobs whereby they're paid to conduct surveys or by marketing companies. This is the 60s, and the development of consumer society has hit France, as brilliantly described by Annie Ernaux in The Years. So that's very much what we're dealing in. So they're trying to hold on to as I say, their sort of student lifestyle without being students, but they have these aspirations. They want things because they've entered the consumer society, or the country's entered consumer society, and they like what they see. They like what's on offer, but they don't have the money for it because they're doing this rather modest sort of contractual stuff, piecework, and. You know, so they have to do everything on the cheap, you know, go to flea markets and go to antique shops. And they, of course, instead of a whole, you know, dining room set, they're going to get 1 or 2 chairs that mimic and mirror, you know, what their betters and more rich people have in their houses. But it also suggests quite sort of brilliantly, I feel, that I don't know whether one would describe them as petit bourgeois or a new bourgeois, but, you know, they don't have the imagination to come up with their own aesthetic sense. All they do is they just look at those of the, you know, the better offs, the uber rich in France, and go, yeah, these people have taste and style. We want the same. And I think that's a very prescient key point that Perec makes. And it comes to a point where they feel they've got to change their lives. So they both apply to become I assume French teachers in Tunisia, but unfortunately they're given jobs at schools in different cities. That's not going to work. So they decide they'll go. The woman will take up her job, and the man will just go and obviously live with her, and he'll find a job where they are. But it's the city that she's in is not a big city, and he can't find employment. And so there's a lot of him having time on his hands walking around, and there's nothing, you know, sort of thinking back to what was on offer in Paris, and here they have nothing. So it's a brilliant contrast and a brilliant critique, I think, of the newly emergent materialist culture of France. Terrific story. The second one, A Man Asleep, the story itself was less engaging, but some of the writing in it, some of the insights in it were incredible. So basically it's a guy who sets his alarm to wake him up for his final university exams. The alarm goes off, he decides, you know, he's sort of, I need 10 more minutes sleep, so he kills the alarm, doesn't get up for the exam, misses the exam, and that changes his whole life for him in his own mind, that he's getting off the treadmill that you know, every stage of his childhood and youth had been leading up towards, get this qualification, go into whatever bourgeois job. Instead, he decides that he's going to live without affect, without attachments, as much as possible, sort of in that sort of Buddhist way of repudiating sort of the reality around you as not being real. But of course, if you transpose any Eastern body of thought to the Western lifestyle, it doesn't stack up. So, you know, he still has to feed himself, he still has to wash his socks, all this kind of stuff. So he can never fully relinquish it. So that's the basis of the story, but it was really just some of the writing. Indifference has neither beginning nor end. It is an immutable state, a dead weight, an unshakable inertia. Doubtless, messages from the outside world still make it through to your nerve centres, but no organised response involving the totality of the organism appears to be able to develop. All that remains are elementary reflexes. When the light is red, you do not cross the road. You shelter from the wind in order to light a cigarette. You wrap up warmer on winter mornings. You change your sports shirt, your socks, your underpants and your vest about once a week, and your bed linen roughly every fortnight. Indifference dissolves language and scrambles the signs. You are patient and you are not waiting. You are free and you do not choose. You are available and nothing arouses your enthusiasm. You ask for nothing, you demand nothing, you make no impositions. You hear without ever listening, you see without ever looking. The cracks in the ceilings, in the floorboards, the patterns in the tiling, the lines around your eyes, the trees, the water, the stones, the cars passing in the street, the clouds that form cloud shapes in the sky. So he may imagine that he has freedom, a bit like the freedom of the hobo or the tramp, but there's nothing going on. You know, the lights are on, but nobody's home with such a life, for this guy at least, anyway. So it just doesn't work for him. So I think in a way those two stories, although they were written quite and published separately, one is it's all about material things, and the other is all about giving up material things, but they both lead to the same unhappy place. Terrific stuff, as usual, by Perec, 5 stars. And that's what I've read. As to what I'm currently reading, I'm reading Dino Buzzati's The Tartar Step. About a third of the way through that. And then I've got some books I'm really looking forward to. I picked a book up off Eric Carl Anderson's recent video about 10 female experimental novels. There was one there I hadn't heard of before. So I've picked that up, and that will probably be my next read. Stupidly, I haven't got it with me to show you. So that's it. Till next time, thanks very much.